Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the last day of the City UK's National Conference. The first 2 days are focused on recovering and rebalancing, respectively, and today features forward-looking discussions on technology, innovation, and sustainability. I'm Marcus Scott, and I'm the City UK's Chief Operating Officer. And for this morning's session on FinTech, I'm privileged to be joined by Bryony Widdup, partner at DLA Piper, Natalie Ceeney, CBE Chair of Innovate Finance, and Stephen Ingledew, Executive Chair of FinTech Scotland. Each of the panelists has enormous experience of founding, running, advising, scaling, and deal-making in FinTech. And I'm going to ask them for their perspective on where we go next, how we grow financial technology in the UK, and what we can do to ensure that the UK remains competitive in this rapidly evolving digital market. After that, we'll move to some Q&A, and I also plan on touching on some of the hard-to-solve issues of SME digitalisation, inclusion, and using technology to help towards the levelling up agenda of the UK economy. I'm also keen to draw out some national and regional perspectives in keeping with the overarching theme of the conference, so please post questions and please challenge us. We'll be asking you a question on the screen after the panellists have given some initial impressions, and if you could answer that in the app, you'll find that it'll flash up in front of you, and then we'll be able to use the responses to that to trigger some of the questions later on. So firstly, I'm going to start with Bryony. Bryony, I imagine you've seen a wide spectrum of FinTech activity. And what themes are emerging?
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me today. Lovely to be here. Yes, wide spectrum of FinTech activity. And I think, you know, the main themes coming out of this year and COVID-19, etc., and this has been said so many times, but it's no less relevant in the FinTech industry, is uncertainty. And it's really been a mixed bag of impact in FinTech, because on the one hand, you know, you've got that general kind of the macroeconomic environment, which makes for difficult times for all businesses, and in particular, businesses that generally are in phases where they need input of capital and investment, and they need people to take risk around, you know, putting capital investment into their business models, which is the case for a lot of FinTech businesses. So on the one hand, you've got that general kind of negative position. On the other hand, the pandemic in particular has driven a huge boost in digital uptake. You know, if you just think about social conditions and how social conditions, distancing, you know, decreased personal contact, etc., have led to just generally much broader uptake in terms of digital use for things like payments and, you know, reduction in cash use. I think it's a really mixed story. You know, I think this session needs to be looking as well at the positive story. You know, this sector is very agile. It's not burdened with kind of inefficient, legacy, difficult to move systems, for example, and it's very resilient as a result. It can be very resilient. And I think, you know, we need to look at the positives. We have a really good thing in the UK with our FinTech sector, and the conversation needs to be around how we continue to support and grow those businesses moving forward.
Thank you, Bryony, and I totally agree. I think, you know, there's been some really positive stories, and particularly that uptake of technology. I also want to come back later on to the investment side of it. And first of all, Natalie, I'd just like to ask you to give your perspective. You're in a unique position at the heart of the FinTech industry, seeing both the take-up, the development of firms, but also the funding of firms. What are the themes that you're focusing on?
And maybe if I start by building on Bryony's points, I mean, I absolutely agree. This has been a very successful sector up to now that's very nimble, very agile, and is well poised to help us going forward. And maybe if I start with some of the themes that FinTech still needs to solve, and it's worth reminding ourselves that a lot of the regulatory context that was created for FinTech, which has helped it be a success, was created out of the last crisis, because there were many societal issues, economic issues that needed to be solved, and we wanted that nimble set of players. And we've still got a lot of those issues to solve. We've still got 1.4 million people unbanked. Even before COVID, 1 in 10 people had no savings at all. A third had less than £600 in savings. That's got worse, of course, over COVID. We've got a looming pensions crisis. We've got small businesses who can't universally get credit or even bank accounts. All of those things are why we need this sector, which is so agile and nimble. So some of the themes that I hear from fintechs of what we need to do, the UK is already very good at fintech, but some other countries are catching up. And what we need to do is work out where the gaps are and frankly, steal the best ideas out there and stay ahead. And it probably won't surprise people to know that some of the themes are talent. Already 43% of the employees in UK fintech come from overseas, 28% come from the EU. Brexit's going to make that harder, but there's stuff we can do because the UK is a very attractive place to work. Funding, we're very, very good at startup funding. We're less good at scale up capital. About 50% of tech scale up capital comes from outside the UK right now. Again, there's more we can do to attract investment into the UK. And our regulatory regime has been fantastic at startups. Now, what's really good is our regulators are looking at scale up. The speech from the PRA last week was excellent in terms of the prudential structure, and I know that the FCA are also looking at things. So I think we're going to need fintech over the next decade, even more than we have over the last decade. The UK is still a great place to be a fintech, but there's a lot we can do to make ourselves even better.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'd like to come back a little bit later on to some of those issues and delve into those in more detail. But first of all, Stephen, Scotland has always been a nurturing ground for new technology, from electronics in the 90s and the 2000s to clean tech and now fintech. What's emerging?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Delighted to be with you this morning. There's 3 points I'd like to bring out that really, I believe, can add to this revitalisation agenda for financial services in the UK, but also for the whole economy. The 3 points really, the practical steps are, one is about adoption. We need to ensure for fintech really to take a hold and grow, help support growing the economy. It needs to move from a project mindset to much more business as usual, kind of as part of the overall operation, a more pervasive approach to innovation by big organisations working with small. So let's be really serious about it, move from really a lot of good talk to actually much more action, and that's around adoption. The second area is really this aspect about collaboration. It's not just about collaboration between big and small enterprises, it's about actually being inclusive, bringing in the role of citizen groups, bringing in the role, for example, of universities. So it's much more impactful. And a good example of that in Scotland, where we've established the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence with the support of Innovate UK. And I believe that model could be applied in other areas across the UK to really generate that inclusive collaboration that drives fintech for everybody's benefit. And the third area is recognising that fintech actually has a role to play across the whole economy in terms of revitalising, for example, our retail sector, in energy tech, in health tech, and that application, makes fintech really more of a horizontal approach, really, in terms of deriving the benefits. It also allows us to bring in innovations from other sectors. We've seen some great enterprises moving from example, space tech into fintech, and also from oil and gas into the world of fintech. So that cross-fertilization and innovation will really drive some new creativity in new enterprises.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And that cross-fertilization, I think, is incredibly important. I mean, when I think about some of the people who've come into fintech from other areas and who indeed then go out into other areas, that's become increasingly important. What we're now going to do is we're going to put a question up on the screen for you, and I wondered if you could just answer that as we go through the next question. And once we've got the answer to the question, I'm going to come back to Bryony and have a quick chat about the question itself and the answers that we get. And whilst you're all answering, Natalie, I'd just like to come back to you on the 2 of the things that you mentioned. In my mind, they seem to split up into almost 2 categories. You've got an inclusion element, and you mentioned things like 1.4 million people unbanked, and being unbanked electronically is soon going to become a massive problem for individuals. You've got 1 in 10 people who haven't got, 1 in 10 households who haven't got broadband. So that's the kind of inclusion problem. But then at the same time, you've also got a kind of capital formation and savings problem. And I know there's been a number of really good innovative things which have helped people to take small amounts of money and put it away into savings and do various different things in really innovative ways. But what do you see the role of government in all of this, and where would you like government to participate?
So I think FinTech has no shortage of ideas. And in fact, if you look across all those aspects of inclusion, you will find a FinTech who has a great idea and possibly a proposition to solve virtually every problem known to man. The challenge, to Stephen's point, is adoption. And a lot of these customer segments are not hugely profitable for incumbents to serve. And also, they're best served by everybody working together, which actually is quite genuinely a challenge for some of the banks in terms of competition law. And this is where I think government can step in. So we've already got some good examples. The rent recognition challenge 2 years ago, where the government saw an issue, the issue being that Generation Rent needed to build up credit references, but they didn't have a mortgage and they didn't necessarily have bank cards, but they did pay rent. So government put out a challenge, looked for the best fintechs to develop a solution that allowed renters to build up a good credit record. Fintech met that challenge, that developed some mainstream services, which then got widely adopted. So I think what government can do is help catalyse the industry and bring them together to come up with some joint solutions. The ideas and the technology may be powered by fintech, but we need mass adoption across incumbents so that anybody, whoever they bank with, whoever they shop with, can get access to services. And then finally, needless to say, I think the government has a key role in infrastructure. The fintech industry can't solve the fact that 1 in 10 households don't have good broadband. That's something I know the government's working on, but it's actually pretty essential if we're going to have a digital economy, let alone an economy where fintech thrives.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And I think we did a report a couple of years ago about the kind of platforms and the opportunities for collaboration. And certainly we had a very good response from the government stakeholders that we engaged with around that. And I think there was a lot of willingness to do that. Do you think that there are some particular themes in that? So for example, when we did this report, I think it's probably about 18 months, 2 years ago, one of the things that came up in that is that if you develop an industry utility, you get a single point of failure. If you develop a kind of platform, a kind of industry standard and a standard that people can develop products to, then it's much more flexible. I guess it's a bit like electronics in the way that, you know, for Bluetooth, for example, there's an industry standard and anybody can develop a Bluetooth product based on those. Do you think that's the way, or do you think that's sort of evolving into something else?
I think the answer is it depends on the issue. I instinctively share your view that a standard approach is good. There are actually some areas where a single industry solution might be a good one. So for example, it might be great to have standards for carers cards so that actually whoever you bank with, you know the carer card does the same thing. But actually, if you look at things like maintaining cash access as society goes digital, actually, I think you might move to more of a utility solution. So I think it depends, but certainly the assumption has to be, let's work together to solve some of these common issues, because it's frankly not profitable and not effective to try and do this institution by institution. And we do need to include the most vulnerable if we're going to make the maximum out of fintech, but also if we're going to help society be included in a digital, increasingly digital world.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got the answers to the questions in, so I think that's going to trigger a few more. So thank you very much, that's great. Okay, so top 3 areas of focus, quite clear there that we've got some really important ones coming in. Overwhelmingly cybersecurity and payments fraud and personal data and data protection coming up there as really important elements of it. Bryony, I'd like to come to you, because I know that this idea of the kind of the ecosystem and how everything fits together, and the fact that, You know, if you want one part of the system to work, it's got to be able to be interoperable with other parts of the system, but they're not all going to come from the same supplier. It's a bit like we were talking about with Natalie, is, you know, standards rather than one single point of failure. What do you think the current customer expectations are in FinTech, and how people are addressing that?
Well, I mean, yeah, we've heard a lot, haven't we, already about, I mean, people have mentioned already kind of whole economy approach, cross-fertilization, the importance of that in terms of this industry. And then, you know, obviously Natalie was also talking about the inclusion piece. And I think, what do customers expect? You know, customers expect instant, low cost and secure. That's really what they want around their whole financial dealings, I think, now. And it's not sort of, you know, some future proposal. That's immediate now. That's what is being delivered and needs to continue to be delivered. And I think as we see greater adoption in amongst consumers, and you know, in particular, as we mentioned before, driven by current circumstances for digital payments, we really have that security piece at the very top of the agenda, you know, as the poll highlighted. And the important thing to realize about that is that it feeds back into this cross-fertilization piece, because your customer-facing payments company, which has designed a fantastic, you know, user-friendly piece of payments technology, maybe an app that goes along with that, etc., is not necessarily the company that's going to be supporting fully that cybersecurity piece. That's a whole different segment of specialism, and those things need to grow and come up together. So you can't just focus on one bit of this industry and say, you know, right, payments is great, we're going to do everything with payments, payments going to push payments. You've got to ensure that all of the different parts of this ecosystem are supported, because it's the interoperability of that ecosystem which gives places like the UK's fintech industry its real strength and real kind of resilience. So I think, you know, if we just look at payments example, you've got the customer facing piece, which we've already just touched on. You've got the tech piece that sits behind that. So you've got the software, the app development, you know, perhaps you've got a hardware piece as well. You know, we've all seen the proliferation of those, the little handheld card payment devices, you know, into all types of businesses this year because of the need for agility. You've got the data storage piece, and that obviously came up as well in the poll. You've got data processing and data storage. So you've got companies like Thought Machine and, you know, other companies like that need to be in this ecosystem to also plug in and deal with those types of pieces. You've then got your regulatory and compliance piece. So you need service providers in those segments which have the right knowledge, the right, you know, specialisms to be able to apply best standards from regulatory and compliance perspective into this industry. You've got cybersecurity, which we've already touched on. You know, you need to protect this business from fraud and other illegality, because you've got to maintain that trust in the system. And then, you know, maybe coming along as well in the background, and maybe not quite so customer facing at the moment, but you've got AI development. You know, you've got what Stephen mentioned about universities, about that real cutting edge of the kind of education research piece as well. All of those things go into making up some of the strength of our payments ecosystem as we have it now. It's not just about, you know, I don't know, TransferWise company that has the kind of payments customer facing piece. There's a whole background to that. And I think understanding that we need to support that whole thing equally and together is really important. You've got to maintain that ecosystem and the network between those businesses in order to keep this industry moving forward.
And are you seeing that develop more in your client base when you see fintechs coming along with a particular idea and a bit of initial early funding? Are you seeing them starting to design those security, trust and processes in as part of the base product for the first for the first iteration of their product?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the understanding around, what's needed to build a quality product. I mean, there's still a decent amount of competition, and in terms of building quality, you've got a lot of innovation hubs which are fantastic and which can help businesses to understand what goes into building quality fintech products, and those security elements, the data piece and the regulatory and compliance are absolutely key from the very beginning. We see more and more conversations as well about interoperability, which we have already, I think, mentioned that word once in this panel. And so that piece, it's no good having kind of lots and lots of smaller separate proprietary systems. The whole thing about the finance industry is that it's about transmission of value. People often talk about it like it's the fuel. If every different type of vehicle on the roads needed a different type of fuel to go into, to make those vehicles drive, that really wouldn't work for the transport industry. So thinking about it in that way, you need to create that interoperability between systems. We've heard a lot about that recently as well in the kind of blockchain-based platform space and in the business-to-business piece. So building interoperable digital infrastructure that sits behind the delivery of financial services to customers is really high on the agenda and becoming much more important. And that's probably not just a national thing either. You really got to think about that from a complete global perspective.
Yeah. And Stephen, just, in your comments, you mentioned collaboration when in particular with universities, but that idea of this challenge of adoption and of this big embracing small and really sort of creating this cohesion. How do you see us able to foster that wider collaboration? What do you think some of the key elements of that are?
Yes, it's a great question, Marcus. And I think just building on some of the really important points that Brian's made there about this interoperability, there are some really terrific examples. And I think, therefore, we can bring it alive by highlighting those examples. I'll just point out one. The digitization of credit unions is such an important part for our economy and citizens. And if you take if I use an example of what SOAR, who are really at the leading edge of digitizing some of the credit unions, working alongside the payment fintech Modular, working with the FCA and the payments regulator together, they're adopting a mindset of a form of collaboration where together as a small cohort, they can bring together a solution to a specific sort of area where there needs to be this adoption at scale, because credit unions do have an important role to play in our society. The second example, where there's a big opportunity with the physical presence of banks in communities, has obviously been withdrawing over recent years for various sort of reasons, but that community banking has such an important role to play for many, particularly from an inclusion point of view, and those who haven't had the opportunity for digital adoption. Therefore, take the example of One Banks leading the way. They'll start the first range of new community banks, not really to replace the existing important financial institutions we have today, but really to pull together this collaborative ecosystem to ensure that those really in communities such as Denny, near Falkirk, or on the west coast of Scotland, can be provided with some key banking services where there's an individual or a small business. And I think it's these examples, plus others from other parts of the UK, that can highlight that actually this shift to much more of a collaborative mindset rather than a competitive one will help different organisations come together to address the friction areas that Natalie referred to.
Natalie, I wonder if I could come back to you on that, because I think I'd like to talk a little bit about that kind of funding ecostructure and that conveyor belt that really sort of goes from companies achieving success and then sometimes potentially being acquired. Many years ago, I worked in the semiconductor industry, and there most of the new product innovation came from buying startups. So a bigger company would traditionally buy a startup that would turn into a new product, and then what would happen is the entrepreneurs would go out and start their second, third, fourth or fifth startup. And that sort of environment is one that I think we aspire to have, because it's a kind of Silicon Valley environment. Obviously, with what's happened this year, are you seeing that in any way being disrupted, or has that been pretty resilient? And where do we take that next?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So if we look at investment trends over the last few years, what we've seen are a couple of things. Firstly, I mean, UK has remained a very good place for investors to want to invest. We are much better at generating our own startup capital within the UK than we are scale up. Scale up, we see actually quite few deals in the UK, but they're quite big deals, but a high proportion of the funding comes from overseas. And I think that does present the challenge you've outlined, because actually, if you're an entrepreneur, you can get the seed funding quite easily. Series B plus is hard. So actually, at that point, it might be easier to accept a couple of £1 million and sell up or franchise your options to an incumbent, rather than try and build the next big challenger. And we do need to solve that problem. What we've seen during COVID is this has slowed down globally. It's slowed down for all sectors into the UK. And as a result, although money has still flowed to some extent, the FinTechs who were lucky enough to close a funding round just before COVID struck are in a much better position than those who were just about to do a funding round. And I think willingness of funders to come back into the UK is going to depend on many, many things, including the post-Brexit environment and other issues. But I do think what we really need to solve is this Series B plus issue. And I point anyone who's really interested to the Scale Up Capital report that Innovate Finance co-published a couple of months ago. There are many things we need to look at, from listing regimes, and can we adopt some things that are done in other countries to list innovative companies in a way that works better for founders? Can we look at releasing better growth capital? Can we make it easier for pension funds to exist? Can we make the regime for innovation funding from angel investors easier? There are lots of ideas around at the moment, and I'm hoping they will start being taken quite seriously over the coming months.
So there's a question I'd like to ask all of the panelists, which relates to that. You know, we've just now had the new CEO of the FCA appointed, Nikhil Rathi, and a lot of the regulation for fintechs as they come in, particularly dealing with consumer products, seems to be focused in the FCA, because as yet many of them aren't, many of those startups, because of that scale-up issue that you've discussed, they're not systemically important enough to warrant being regulated by the PRA. So I guess my question to all of the panelists is, do you think there's a risk, due to our previous success, of fintech policy and regulation becoming a little bit complacent? And if there is, what would you do about it? Let me start with Bryony first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my experience of our regulatory environment for fintech is really very positive. I think, you know, given the sandbox approach, given the kind of open dialogue that we've had, certainly on the legal side with the regulator, and given now the expansion of the sandbox approach into a global sandbox, I do think that really the regulatory environment has been very fertile here for this industry. You know, our regulatory partners are interested, intelligent. They see the benefits of, you know, introducing this type of digitally based, efficient technology to our long-standing financial services industry, and they've embraced the idea of that shake-up in a really positive way. And I think we as a nation need to continue to take that sort of open-minded approach. And I don't think that the regulatory environment around fintech is complacent. You know, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of monitoring proportionality and monitoring where regulation may be needed to kind of control perhaps the riskier aspects. You know, we've seen things like crypto derivatives bans for retail sale, for example, and you know that is an area where clearly there's kind of a high risk high, stakes at play. And I think, the FCA's response is understandable, even if it was pointed out to be, potentially a little bit blanket. But there are other areas where the open approach and the ability to really communicate with industry through bodies like we've got, GDF, we've got Crypto UK, we've got really active industry bodies that can bring that innovation conversation to the regulator and engage and regularly engage in those partnerships with the regulator in order to make sure that the regulatory approach is collaborative. And the crypto industry, for example, that I've worked with for a number of years now, has been crying out for regulation, has wanted it, because that gives it maturity, it gives trust, it puts certainty into the system that then enables those businesses to grow and flourish. So, I have quite a positive story in terms of how this industry interacts with our regulatory environment.
Brilliant, thank you. Stephen, good regulation builds trust, and obviously trust is an important element of adoption. So these things are all very closely linked. What do you think we need to do next in order to keep the momentum that we've got clearly from previous years in the FinTech regulation and in keeping it at the forefront and in the right place?
Yes, Marcus, in short, really, that the regulator is very much at the coalface. It doesn't wait for things to come to it or bodies to go to it. It's actually at the coalface. And we've been very fortunate in Scotland because the FCA at board level agreed to second a very senior regulator into FinTech Scotland from over the last 2 years. And that's been hugely impactful, both in terms of engaging with new innovations. It's been impactful actually in encouraging international enterprises into Scotland and the UK, which is a brilliant point from an inward investment point of view, but also it's provided that insight back to the regulator about some of the dynamics, some of the leadership aspects, some of the process developments, and some of the risks that are heightened by some of the adoption of new technology. So that being at the coalface, and it's something I would, has been a huge benefit, and I would encourage really the FCA to continue that and apply it wider across the UK. We've had some terrific engagement, particularly over this year, not just from the FCA, but the payments regulator, the Bank of England. And I think that being involved in the innovation, participating, not just waiting and watching, is important to ensure our highway code, which is how I see our regulations, very similar to a highway code that's evolved over, 90 years now, has changed over that 90 years. Our regulations will continue to evolve as the transport system evolves, the highway code, in the way that the financial world and economy is evolving. So it's key to our future highway code that you're at the coalface seeing that innovation in practice.
Yeah, brilliant. Natalie, one of the things that you mentioned when you spoke earlier on was about the idea of other countries catching up to where we were. And I think, we've seen around the world different regulators adopting sandboxes. And I think it's a really interesting, isn't it? Because we have to try and balance that desire not to be complacent with also the need not to bash ourselves and to celebrate the things that really are working. But how do we balance those two things? How do we avoid complacency but make sure that we celebrate what we've got? I think you're on mute.
I'm slightly more worried about the risk of complacency, I suppose, than others. Not because I think there's anything wrong with our regulators. I think we've got very, very good regulators in the FCA and PRA who understand the challenges, but because those regulators and government have got an awful lot on their plate. And there is a real risk of people saying, don't worry, FinTech's okay. We've got bigger crises, we can leave it for a bit. And I think the problem is that will do quite a lot of harm. So maybe if I highlight what some others have done. I mean, Singapore, everyone looks at when they're thinking about regulatory regimes on FinTech. It's of course a tiny economy. It's not actually generating an awful lot of FinTechs. But what's impressive there is the way the regulators and government are working in a very, very joined up way to look at the right infrastructure for FinTech. We've seen some examples during the pandemic. So for example, Australia channeled a lot of its support money out, their equivalent to Bibbles and Sibbles, through FinTechs. Now, we didn't do that in the UK. I understand why we didn't, but actually it's put the FinTechs in Australia forward, whereas it actually put some of our FinTechs back. And we've seen a whole swathe of initiatives in France about supporting the ecosystem for fintech. Now, I still think the UK is a better environment than any of those three, but I think we should steal with pride and make sure the UK stays ahead. And I think my list of some of those things would be, we've talked about investment. Talent is a key thing that every fintech I speak to talks about. It's already pretty hard to get talent. There's a global war for the best fintech talent. It is just factually true that the end of free movement is going to make that harder. No, we can tackle that. We can look at a visa regime, but we do need to do that if we're going to continue to attract the best talent. We are already hearing our regulators talk about more proportionate environments as you go from startup to scale up. That's great. Let's look at that. Let's also look at infrastructure. So we've talked about connectivity on broadband. Digital ID is another area where actually we've got a lot of friction in the UK because we don't have it, whereas other countries that do have digital ID have just got that backbone that they can make, whether it's payments or frankly virtually anything, just work more simply and include more people in adoption. So there's some of the areas we can focus on to build and frankly to stay ahead.
Yeah. And Bryony, I'd like to come back on that digital ID question again, if I may, because one of the things, when you talked about the ecosystem, there's this big element where digital ID would solve so many problems, but it would also make so many other people feel uncomfortable. And I wonder if you've got any ideas as to how we might balance that off, because again, it all seems to be coming back to this issue about trust. Trust leads to adoption, trust leads to, a lot of this is coming back to trust. Have you got any ideas there about how we might sort of make that work and how we might make sure that there's safeguards in there that protect everybody?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, there are some great examples around the world. So I do quite a bit of work with the Nordic regions, and they have different kind of bank ID type products, which is basically a digital ID product that just covers the whole country. And when you look at the kind of Nordic experience, you just think, like Natalie said, wow, that would make things so simple. However, we obviously don't have that here, and it's I think what you're getting at, Marcus, is like it's slightly cultural. We've got a bit of a cultural resistance to that sort of black and white digital identity item. One of the ideas here that I think is quite interesting, and also maybe just also mentioning again how the pandemic has changed things, was having intermediary identity services, which they control your digital ID package. So you have, as an individual, you have a relationship with one kind of ID service provider. That ID service provider then, without transmitting data, but having the kind of verification or certification trust relationship with all of your other financial services providers on the other side of their kind of client relationship, could then verify your ID to all those service providers, so that then it's a much more controlled situation for the individual, as opposed to having their sort of actual digital ID package being delivered multiple times over to many different service providers, and potentially in the way that, we all interact with our apps and digital services and just tick the yes, I consent box. I think it frightens people, the idea that if you just have to tick that box, yes, my digital ID may be accessed by this company, that piece of information can just end up like absolutely all over the place via digital means without too much control. So potentially an intermediary solution where the individual has a relationship with a single intermediary is one idea, and I think potentially positive idea. The pandemic has certainly changed how we do digital ID. I think people and not going into places with a hard copy of their passport. I mean, just from a lawyer's perspective, when you're verifying a client, that's not happening. There's a lot more of this, take a selfie and then take a picture of your passport photo, and then a piece of technology matches up whether or not the photos, are similar enough for you to be passed for that ID check. There's a lot more of that happening. And I think familiarity with those types of processes is increasing by necessity because of the current situation. And that may help, culturally, things have changed enormously in a really short space of time. And so that may also help shifting that kind of cultural resistance to digital identity. But ultimately, it is going to be something that we all need to have, and it plays into the inclusion piece that that Natalie's been talking about too. That's a really important aspect, to make sure that that financial inclusion is key with older people, as well as maybe people who don't have access to a mobile phone hardware in order to be able to make those verifications.
Yeah, and I guess that also plays into that element of trust, inclusion, as you were talking about, because it's always been much more expensive to do anything pay as you go than it has been to sort of enter into a contract traditionally, in terms of mobile phones, in terms of gas, in terms of all sorts of other services. And so therefore it's very much more expensive as a proportion of income for people on lower incomes. And I guess what we've now got is an opportunity to see FinTech solve some of those problems. I know, Stephen, that you've mentioned that there are some Scottish examples of fintechs that are addressing these issues, such as supporting claiming social security benefits. How do we support that? And do you think there is a government intervention needed there, or is that part of a kind of wider social contract that we should be talking about? How do you see that evolving?
Yes, Marcus. I mean, we are on this journey, particularly when it comes to data, as Bryony sort of pointed out, really. And I think a key part about this journey that we're on, back to my point of saying earlier about this collaboration, it needs to involve citizens. It needs to involve those who are impacted by it being done in a darkened room by a fintech or by a larger enterprise. And therefore, creating the environment for more inclusive participation. And that's how the example that you've mentioned there of Invest, a very exciting fintech based in Scotland, actually run by some Spanish lead entrepreneurs, working with the university, working with some of the public bodies, social security, in order to help people who are entitled to social benefits be able to claim in an efficient and effective way, in a timely way, when that can be such a burden on people, particularly when approaching the social security system for the first time. And that has been really impactful in terms of reducing financial stress, improving well-being, but ensuring people get the access to the right benefits at the right time. So that's just one small example. And probably then, to build on your point, what can be done? There are other areas of government services where FinTech has a relevance. And we're seeing some terrific initiatives between GovTech, FinTech, combining the two. That is in the services that government provides, whether to citizens or businesses or to communities, do have a financial element to it. And it can always be improved by bringing in more innovative businesses rather than, with respect, dealing with the traditional big tech players who have a big transformational solution, but isn't necessarily the way to deliver that in the immediate future. So another example of this cross-fertilization between public sector and entrepreneurs driving innovation, and that development that benefits, I think, people and businesses over time.
Well, thank you all very much. I mean, despite the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the rather strange year that we've had, this has been an incredibly optimistic panel session. We've covered elements such as interoperability, digitalization of the entire economy, not just the prosperous parts of the economy, supported by things like universal broadband availability. And it feels like there's lots of opportunity to solve some problems that have really been bugging people for a long time. And also, we talked about the role of government setting the framework, not picking winners, but extending that regulatory environment and keep building it. And Natalie, I think you've invented a new phrase, and I'm afraid I'm going to use it shamelessly. Steal with pride, I think, is just absolutely brilliant. I love that. So it just remains for me to thank you all very much for a wonderful panel. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope the people watching have enjoyed it as much as I have. I just want to remind everyone that's watching that the next event is the keynote speaker from the City Minister, John Glenn, and I hope you can join us for that. But with that, I would just like to say a big thank you to the panelists, and see you all again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.